Thanks for joining us today for your thoughts. That's Joe Walsh, who is now a Democrat in the USA, very much a former Conservative Republican. Pienaar Friends is coming up.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the Times.
It's 6 o'clock. I'm John Pienaar. Welcome to Pienaar and Friends, which tonight is Mikey Smith from the Mirror and Kate Ferguson from the Sun on Sunday. And you, I'm very happy to say, share your thoughts, send me a text, send me a tweet, and we can chat after the news with Laura Cook.
Thank you. Good evening. Defence Secretary John Healey says Russia's routinely firing more than 300 drones a day into Ukraine, a rate it can sustain throughout 2025. But he admitted Ukraine's proving it's fighting back with its simultaneous attacks on multiple air bases deep inside Russia.
Hats off to Ukraine for Spiderweb. It reminds us that Ukraine can inflict deep damage on the Russian military. It reminds us that Ukraine is very much in this fight and determined to prevail.
The Kremlin called it an escalation. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky also dismissed a Russian ceasefire proposal as spam and reiterated calls for direct negotiations with Vladimir Putin. Meanwhile, Donald Trump has written on Truth Social that he's had a phone call with Vladimir Putin lasting an hour and 15 minutes. He referred to the call as a good conversation, but claimed it was not one that will lead to immediate peace. Changes to the winter fuel allowance are expected, but it's not clear who will receive it. The Chancellor confirmed today, though, that more pensioners will be eligible this winter, with last year's move to means test a £300 payment coming in for fierce criticism. Pensions researcher Daniela Silcock hopes any new criteria doesn't just centre around money.
We can't just look at income. We have to look at whether or not people are disabled, the kind of housing they have. Obviously, some houses need more heating in order to stop being damp, and that can lead to other health conditions. So it's difficult actually to target it on an income level.
The Prime Minister has accused Israel of counterproductive and intolerable actions in Gaza as he threatened more sanctions over issues with humanitarian aid. Food deliveries have been paused at 3 sites, with Israel's military warning nearby roads would be considered combat zones. Gaza's Hamas-run health ministry claims dozens have been killed in recent gunfire at these centres. Shadow Foreign Secretary Priti Patel says the situation is harrowing.
The level of humanitarian suffering and desperation continues to be unacceptable as children, women and their families continue to suffer while desperately trying to secure food and humanitarian aid. These deaths and casualties near aid distribution centres should never have happened.
An audit shared with The Times has revealed mental health hospitals responsible for violent criminals have policies which allow biologically male patients to self-identify as women. Campaigners warned the NHS trusts are playing Russian roulette with women's safety by placing transgender women who were born male on female wards. In some cases, hospitals acknowledge that some trans patients may pose a risk to a particular gender or very distressing for other patients on a single-sex ward. HMRC says it's detected unauthorised access to some accounts, but insists it was a target of an attempt to claim money rather than customers. Those affected have been locked down and login details have been deleted. HMRC say anyone affected will be told, but they don't need to do anything. Remember, our news podcasts are on the Times Radio app. Look for the Times News Briefing and The World in 10.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, on the free Times Radio app and via your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
It is good to have you with us here on Pienaar and Friends, an hour of good conversation in very good company. Tonight, that is Kate Ferguson, the political editor at The Sun on Sunday. Hello, Kate.
Hi, John.
Great to see you back. And Mikey Smith, deputy political editor at the Mirror. Hello, Mikey.
Hello.
So we got Mikey and Fergie. Now, there was a good pair. And welcome to both of you. Kate, can I start with you? What's your thought for the day?
I've got a thought for the day, which is about Greenwich Council. This is a council right next door to where I live, a Labour-run Killjoy council, you may say, because there's this pub in Greenwich which is doing a brilliant, booming trade, creating money and jobs and growth, called the Trafalgar. And they're right by the river in South London. And they have put lots of benches outside to make the most of the tourist footfall that you get around there. And the Killjoy, I have to say, Labour Council is now telling them that they want to take down their outside nice seating and benches because they're claiming it blocks the footpath. But I walked down there most weeks, and I can confirm it does not block the footpath. So, we're meant to be encouraging businesses. Pubs are already having a tough time with the hated Nix tax rise. Live and let live. Let them serve beer outside. What's the big deal, Greenwich Council? I note the local MP, I think, is Matthew Pennycook, who is a housing minister in charge of turbocharging growth. So I do wonder what he has to say about his local council.
Yeah, I would do like a bit of a passionate point of view, especially in this part of the programme. My instinct is generally to side against local councils that stop people having fun. I also note that you put your emphasis on the importance of economic growth. I sense it's really about fun, isn't it, Kate?
It's also about fun. Stop being so bossy. Let's have a bit more fun. Let them drink beer, as Marie Antoinette would have said if she was British.
Yeah, we've got to be careful here because we're now siding against the Trafalgar pub in Greenwich, which I haven't had the pleasure of drinking in.
It's lovely.
It's lovely. There we go.
It's very nice.
Balance on this show all the way. Mikey, what's your thought for the day?
My thought for the day is actually something we touched on briefly last week, I think, and has been living in my head since then, which is 20 mile an hour speed limits. So what I didn't realise until I saw a tweet this week is that it's Reform UK's official policy to abolish all 20 mile an hour speed limits.
Make them all, make those bumps flat.
I suspect much of this is aimed at Wales, where they'd like to do very well. But it is their national policy. They want to do away with 20 mile an hour speed limits. Now, it is very, very rare that you find such overwhelming evidence, both empirical and scientific, in favour of what is, if we're all being honest with ourselves, a very, very small change in behaviour. Reducing speed limits from 30 miles an hour to 20 miles an hour in built-up areas reduces the number of not only all accidents, but child injuries, and by a ridiculous number. In some places, it's as much as 75% the reduction in child deaths from road accidents, just from taking that down. And I've been trying to work out, beyond irritation, how you could possibly argue against reducing speed limits by just 10 miles an hour. Yeah. Just drive a little slower.
I've heard it argued that you can't know how many lines it would take, but I guess all you've got to do is compare the accident statistics before the limit to the figures after the limit, and then you just sort of common sense, which is that if you strike someone with a car at 20 miles an hour, you're going to do less damage and kill fewer people than you would do at 30 or 40 miles. That's just inescapably. Are you going to be wonderfully libertarian?
I'm going to be more libertarian here. Look, I have no problem with these limits outside schools. People should not speed in their cars. There's no excuse for that. However, listeners, I've got a confession to make. I did try and learn to drive, and I didn't pass a test. Sorry, I did sit my test quite a lot of times. Sadly for me, I never passed the test. I did sit it about 4 or 5. I challenge anyone to pass a test in Bow Roundabout. Anyway, but the first time I was trying to learn to drive, I was driving around Haringey and Islington, the first hated 20 mile per hour borough, and there I was, and you can barely get halfway around the streets before I had to go back home again because you're going so slowly. It's impossible to learn to drive in London because of 20 mile per hour limits now. And the cyclists, they're going faster. They're sticking 2 fingers up at the law. They're going this way, that way, going through lights, going at gosh knows how long.
Yeah.
Don't get me started.
I think the true terror on the road at the moment is the cyclist and not the car.
Well, I mean, being hit by a cyclist, probably going to hurt, less likely to kill you.
Sure, but actually, as a non-driver, but that's the skin I had in the game. I could not learn to drive at 20 miles an hour.
I passed my test when it was a little after I was supposed to, but I passed my test. But I've never driven, really. In my 45 years nearly, I've owned a car for exactly 6 months when I had to drive across the Pennines every day for work for a little bit. If it had been any longer than that, I would have just moved to Manchester.
Yeah, I do just quietly, in an under voice, confess to occasionally being irritated by cycles on the road, by bicyclists on the road. I mean, I know there's no defending this position, but they kind of irritate me, and this is even less defensible. I just get the impression that they're being very smug just by being there. I can't defend that position.
I have no problem with cyclists on the road. I have problem with cyclists on the pavement. And that is a problem in Greenwich.
Yeah.
I'm out there walking my little boy, and he's little, but he walks. He likes to walk. And we walk hand in hand, and you get these cyclists trying to cut a corner, and they go across a paved area. And that's
No, they're a terror.
Have you given up learning to drive?
So I was thinking about, it was my New Year's resolution to learn, but I haven't done anything about it. But also, it's been so long since I passed my theory. I had to go back and redo the theory. The shame of having to get a new provisional license, like I'm sort of a 17-year-old. But I need to, because I'm all grown up now, and I need to learn to drive.
I only asked this because you volunteered it. I mean, how many times did you take the test?
I think it was like 4 or 5. It's actually it's actually wild. Like, so none of my family drove, because from London, whatever. Like, no one drove. So then I was going to be the first. People are the first in their family to go to university. Sure. I was going to be the first in my family in 1,000 generations to drive. Yeah. And I was trying to learn when I lived in Green Lanes, which is a very clogged up area of North London. Anyway, and I was a little cub reporter on minimum wage, trying to learn to drive, and I spent all my spare money on these lessons, and I just never passed the test.
Look, trust me, don't say this because I'm not trying to drive shame you, but you took 5 tests and you didn't pass. You don't think it might be a good idea that someone like you isn't allowed to drive faster than 20 miles an hour?
I actually do not think this, because the Bow test place is the lowest in the country for pass rates, and it's every man for himself on Bow Roundabout. Like, I would fail on Bow Roundabout, and I'd say to my driving instructor, I actually don't know how you do Bow Roundabout. Like, we start with what seems like 5 lanes, and then they go into 2, and there's no rhyme nor reason about who goes first or second. And the driving instructor just said, you just got to go for it. And I thought, well, no wonder I keep failing.
And just look on the bright side here. Look, you can't drive a car. You're not allowed to drive a car. Maybe that's not a bad thing, because now you can go down to this pub you like in Greenwich whenever you'd like. Which you're so annoyed with the local council about stopping you sitting outside, and you can just have a drink down there when you fancy, and you don't have to worry about driving home. You can get the bus, all of that sort of thing.
Exactly. I can just get one of those M&S gin and tonic tins, get the bus. Happy days.
There you go. Exactly. Find the silver lining. That's what I said. I do want to mention this. There is an easy way to listen to us on Times Radio. You can use your smart speaker, and if you've got an Amazon, Google, or an Apple device, all you need to do is ask it to play Times Radio, and you can listen to Pienaar and Friends with Kate and with Mikey, whoever it happens to be, anytime you like. Strongly recommend it. And we're coming up with Mike and Katie on Pienaar Friends in just a second. Tell me what you're thinking. Send me a text, 87222, whether it's about driving, whether it's about speed limits, whether it is about weightier matters, and there are weightier matters to talk about. Tell me what you think. Send me a text, 87222. Start with the word Times, or a tweet to @Times Radio, or a voice note. I was asked for voice notes, and they get nearly enough of them on WhatsApp. 0333 003 2353. You're listening to Pienaar and Friends here on Times Radio.
Times Radio Breakfast with Nationwide.
The free Times Radio app, and listen to us wherever you are.
John Pienaar on Times Radio.
Now, Mikey Smith from the Mirror and Kate Ferguson from the Sun on Sunday here with me on Pienaar and Friends. And our conversation a moment ago about speed limits and passing driving tests, or rather not passing driving tests in the case of Kate. It's clearly got your imagination. Share a couple of your thoughts on that as they are flooding in. Here's 3 that have flooded in. Dave says 20-mile-an-hour limit doesn't shorten journey time. Why are so many people in such a rush to get to the next red light? Sort of philosophical mood there from Dave. And James says it's nearly impossible to drive at 20 miles an hour, and it burns more petrol on roads with and near schools maybe, but nowhere else. And this is it's to you, Kate. It says, why doesn't Kate take her driving test somewhere quieter? She could always take lessons at the weekend and then just take half a day off to do the test in that area. And here's one which is, I don't know, is this a bit of encouragement from someone with a lot of experience in all of this? Bear with me. I liked this one. Someone who said they started learning in America at the age of 21 and now at the age of 45. Have they cracked it? I'm not sure they've even cracked it. 45. So take that as an encouragement. Don't give up. It's worth it. And the feeling of fulfilment. I'm now ad-libbing on the basis of the text. I'm sure what our writer meant to say was there's an enormous sense of fulfilment at the end of it. You haven't given up, have you, Kate, altogether?
I still have the dream. And
I have a dream.
And I texted a driving instructor about 6 months ago. I might get in touch with him after today's show, see what he's doing later.
Glad to have inspired you.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that because they keep on coming. I want to talk a bit about politics now, away from driving, which is what we've been passionately discussing. So that we had this letter published by the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police and other police chiefs. It's in the Times today, and they are doing their bit for the cause of policing as they see it, arguing for more money, police budgets. And here's the thing, they say that if they don't get the money that they need, they're going to have to reprioritise their fight against crime. Some crimes will have to be given a lower priority. They did not set out exactly what they mean by that. We can talk about some possibilities, but it's a pretty, I don't know, when you consider how hard it is, certainly in the eyes of so many people, to get a police officer to come at all and deal with almost any crime, the idea of lowering the priority to some crimes is quite alarming, guys, isn't it?
Hugely so. I mean, that's basically almost holding the Chancellor to ransom. You know, there is a sense in this country, you can look at the stats and you can say it's held up or not, but there is a sense of lawlessness in this country that everyday crimes don't get dealt with, that people just stop even reporting them, all the way from sexual abuse cases, all the way down to kind of shoplifting, that kind of so-called low-level antisocial behaviour crime. Now, if the police chiefs are going to say, look, sorry, mate, we're not going to do high streets and antisocial behaviour and shoplifting, then that's going to have a huge sense to the nation's insecurity, hugely damaging for any governing party if that takes place. I have to say, I don't really like letters like this from Mark Rowley. You know, fine, shake the tin for more money. That's what everyone does this time of year. You do you. But like, don't tell us you won't investigate our crimes. You know, that is a kind of breakdown of the social contract. I'm coughing up, more than half my salary in tax. And I expect if I report a crime for you to try and solve it. Yeah. It's not for you to tell me, sorry, it doesn't, computer says no on that one. And also I'm kind of quite a firm believer in, that kind of broken window strategy. If you tackle low level crime, people will have more respect for themselves, their neighbours, their neighbourhoods, and less likely to kind of commit bigger and other crime. So I think this is I don't like that letter. I think it's trying to hold Rachel Reeves and PM to ransom. But if they follow through on that threat, huge political problem for Labour. And
so many people will consider already there's plenty of prioritisation of crime going on now.
Exactly.
Man, you're nodding your head, Mikey. What do you think?
I entirely agree with Kate. I think this is an incredibly risky strategy. Absolutely. It's completely normal and expected for the leaders of various public services to go cap in hand to the Treasury every time there's a spending review. This is going to be a big spending review right up to the end of the Parliament, and they need to get their warnings in early. Fine, behind closed doors. If you're making these warnings, make them to the Chancellor, make them to the Prime Minister, fine. But there's every risk, as has happened here, that this is going to become public. And what that does is it erodes trust in the police. Yeah. Because if you've done your negotiations behind closed doors, you can then go, look, we've got, we maybe haven't got what we wanted, but we can, we're going to make the best of what we've got. And you still, it doesn't feel like they're saying, it feels like in this situation he's saying whatever happens, unless we get everything we asked for, we're going to have one hand tied behind our backs.
Yes.
Which I'm not sure that's going to be a particularly persuasive thing with Rachel Reeves anyway.
There's a real risk, isn't there, that it could look to an awful lot of people like police chiefs writing themselves their own permit not to do the job of policing. And when you look at the numbers on clear up for crime, they are in so many cases absolutely appalling. When it comes to domestic burglaries, we're talking about a national rate, and it's worse in London, of around 5%. 95% of burglaries, those are the ones that are reported, don't end up in anyone being charged. And when it comes to fraud, the numbers are miserable. Shoplifting, the number of times we've discussed this on this show, and we've discussed it, shoplifting in the high street, where people or gangs walk into a shop, walk out with their pockets and bags full, and the staff don't even call the police. They don't think there's any particular point. And the Home Secretary responded to some outrage about that and said, look, no longer is there a rule. Most people didn't know there was a rule that you don't do very much about a burglary, a shoplifting case involving less than £200 worth of loss. But again, it makes the point. And for rape, the number is even worse. Now, if those are the facts, and those are the facts, this sort of letter doesn't look too good.
No, awful. I think I've talked about this on this show before, but just to mention very briefly, when I was a victim of burglary, I was told by Tweedledum and Tweedledee from the police to go around pawn shops in Lewisham, South London, try and find my own gold rings. Thank you very much, because they weren't going to bother. And then I've got a sister who works in a kind of wine shop on a busy London high street. Now they've moved to buzzing people in now. They won't leave that shop door open because the violent shoplifting was so bad. And so that's the kind of reality, right? So I just don't think cops, they can't just go around saying we won't even bother investigating that. But the reality is that most of us victims of crimes feel like they've already deprioritised.
I suppose in fairness to the chief officers, they weren't quite saying we won't bother. They were saying we won't be able to, that it's tough enough now, we haven't got the staff to do it, and got the same sort of story from the Police Federation. It is tough for the police to keep pace. On the other side again, a bit of, not just devil's advocacy, but there's truth in this. Maybe fear of crime has in many people's minds got a bit magnified, because it is also a fact, and the stats show it, that over the years, domestic burglary, for example, has as a level of crime come down really significantly. That is not necessarily because the police have been incredibly successful in tracking down burglars, recovering property and charging offenders. It's because of household security. It's got so much better.
I mean, yes, crime of this kind has reduced. I do think there is a certain part of Mark Rowley's job, if you're a person living in London, though, that if you're Mark Rowley, at least half of your job is making people confident and making people feel safe. And I think the last thing that you want from your Met Police Commissioner, whatever financial problems the Met is having, is if you get burgled, if you're one of the unlucky few who get burgled and it never gets solved, what you don't want is for the Met Police Commissioner to be going, well, we told you so. Yeah. That's not helping anything. No one wins there. I think
that's such a good point. Like, crime and safety, law and order is perception as much as it is experience. Do you feel like you're safe walking home? Doesn't mean you could feel unsafe walking home 99% of the time and never get attacked, but it's that perception, that feeling.
Do you feel unsafe walking? I mean, you're in South London. You say you're near Greenwich, which is it's not the roughest bit of London, but it's a bit of a mixed neighbourhood, like in Lewisham. It's a bit mixed. I live in the same sort of place, not far from where you are. Do you feel unsafe?
I wouldn't there's definitely bits where I wouldn't walk around at night on my own. There's like rubbish lighting, very bad, like Lewisham, which is the station I get into. That's like terribly absolutely horrifically built round, there was no town planning around there, so there's all these like nooks and crannies, bad lighting, no real streetscape, some houses back on, some of them front on. So yeah, definitely sometimes I don't feel safe. But that look, I grew up in London, that was also true when I grew up in the 90s in Stroud Green, that is kind of part of growing up in a city. But I think that the thing that Mike is talking about, which is instilling confidence, and not telling people when they come round to your house and investigating a burglary or whatever, oh, there's no chance. Maybe just don't say that. Maybe say we're taking it seriously. Do you have any photos? We will look. Don't just be like, oh, you're having a laugh, aren't you? Been ages since we last caught a burglar. Actually, what...
and that was the tone they...
Totally. Yeah. And it was mad because... they say, well, look, there's like half a dozen or a dozen burglars locally. It'll be one of them, but they wear masks, they wear gloves, so we won't be able to link them. And you just think, well, gosh, if that's the extent of policing today, then I'm unclear why I bothered phoning you.
Yeah, I mean, trust is a big problem in itself. I mean, the last numbers I saw showed that around half of people simply don't trust the police. And of those, getting on for 1 in 5 people don't trust the police at all. Now, that is a serious matter. And maybe, as you say, Kate, there are better ways of doing this, more ways than one of skinning a cat. For one thing, well, you can do it privately. That is what you'd expect. And I'm sure they do that a good deal of the time. There's also channels. I mean, you could go to a select committee of the House of Commons where they come along and say these things in a way where it would not land with quite this sort of sensational impact. And you could do what lobbying politics is about. You can find some MPs, no doubt there's plenty of those on both sides of the House, who will take up your cause and put it to the government.
Yep, exactly. Just there's this thing called the Home Affairs Select Committee, or the Ministry of Justice Select Committee, and they will articulate that. I think I'm trying to remember previous years. I mean, it is pretty astounding that they're coming out so publicly. I think it's 2 weeks in a row with a letter in the Times, making this case. It's a specific PR move, right? This is all very much done on purpose. And I do think that it's a Labour government, they can smell that they might get money if they just bang the drum hard enough. They can probably sense that Rachel's in a fair bit of political trouble. Keir's not exactly riding high in the polls despite that massive landslide election last year. So I think they're sniffing out weakness. I was going to say something else, which is they're not the only ones sniffing out weakness. I had a little story last weekend, which was about Ed Miliband being in a row over the spending review with the Treasury, and Ed Miliband might seem like a quiet man, but he stormed out of his meeting with Darren Jones, the number 2 at the Treasury, and I hear slammed the door after, I was told, 9 minutes. Now, that has been denied by Ed's team. However, they wouldn't they? Yeah. But, you're getting these cabinet ministers who are hollering, banging down on Rachel's door, demanding their billions. I'm afraid Wes Streeting and the NHS have it all. And so they're going to be kind of really squeezed. And they're trying to play hard man with Rachel. Yeah. I mean, Ed Miliband, you don't think of him as the most sort of aggressive and forceful character around. And he's also still a bit of a favourite of Keir Starmer, isn't he? Hell yes, he's tough enough, John Pienaar. If the listeners remember, he said that when he was asked if he's tough enough to be PM back in, what would that have been, 2015? Yeah. I mean, the thing is with Ed Miliband is he doesn't come across as, a Rottweiler of Labour politics, but he's one of the only people at that top table that's done it before. Yes. He was knocking about under Brown, right? Yes. He's been leader before. He knows what levers to pull in Whitehall, and that's his strength, probably knowing when to shout. He's got, as we say there, he's got a certain amount of, currency in Downing Street, although he is what we used to call the soft left of the Labour Party. And then we also hear that those close to the Prime Minister, including his Chief of Staff, Morgan McSweeney, is not a huge fan of soft left ministers at the cabinet table with the Parliamentary Labour Party. How does that square? I mean, do you know how that works?
I mean, I actually did a chat with Ed Miliband about 3 weeks ago. I went all the way up to Hull to walk around a solar farm with him at 7 a.m. And much as I love Hull, I didn't enjoy being there at 7 a.m. But he is punchier than you often remember that he is. He was very much making the point that Keir Starmer is up for a fight with Nigel Farage on net zero, and that is actually a thing that he is almost relishing, because I think Starmer, I don't know about what Morgan McSweeney thinks about it, but Starmer thinks that net zero is sort of central to the plan, and B, he thinks it's a fight he can win. And Ed is very much on board with that, as you might expect. Right. But yeah, no, he does. I mean, even though the arguments come pouring in about the cost to households of the net zero project, Starmer thinks he can not just deal with that, not just fend it off, but win it. Yes, win it, because what... So the argument that Ed was making to me is that this is only going to work, and by this he means like the whole of net zero, so that includes energy bills, it includes electric vehicles, the whole lot, it only works if at the end of it, everyone's better off financially. They're not shying away from that. They know that that's the test.
And when will they be better off, Mikey?
Well, that is a question. I think gradually and then all at once is what will happen.
The answer's not now, isn't it? Because our
Not
energy
right
bills
now,
are
no.
the highest in Europe because of those levies. And Ed Miliband keeps banging on about these solar farms and all these jobs. Well, once you've installed a solar farm, there ain't no jobs, really. It's all a fallacy. And that's what Labour are starting to realise. They had hung a lot of their political capital and those big speeches 2-3 years ago where their whole thing was going to be 28 billion a year, all to plough into these green projects. But they're learning that isn't going to create you a new working class base, industrial base. But they're not bringing bills down. And are just giving money to China.
But as with many things, it's a little sort of more nuanced than that. Sorry, that started coming out and I realised how mean it sounded, but I didn't mean it like that. But with the solar farms, the solar farm we went to was entirely powering the local hospital. They get all of their power during the summer months from that solar farm.
During the summer months of Hull.
Summer months of Hull. It was a very grey day. It was a very grey day when we got there, and apparently still works. But the point here is that, yeah, sure, you may not be making jobs all the time forever, but when you're not, you're saving huge amounts of money, which can go into other things.
All right, I'm going to draw a line there because I sort of have to, because I'm looking at the clock. Lots of your thoughts are pouring in on driving and driving tests and driving fines. I'm going to save those up for a little bit later on. You've really got people going with this, Kate. More coming up here on Pienaar and Friends now at 6:31 the news with Laura Cook.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
Thank you. Good evening. Vladimir Putin has told Donald Trump the Kremlin will have to respond to Ukrainian drone attacks on multiple air bases deep inside Russia. The two men have spoken over the phone. HMRC has revealed it's lost £47 million when 100,000 customer accounts were subject to a phishing scam. Officials insist no taxpayers have lost money. More pensioners are to receive winter fuel payments this year, though it's not clear what the new criteria for getting it is yet. Labour's been heavily criticised ever since it moved to means test the allowance. Jeremy Corbyn has accused the government of evasion and silence over the UK's role in the conflict in Gaza. The former Labour leader is calling for a public inquiry into Britain's links to Israeli military operations in the enclave. The Prime Minister's called the IDF's decision to shut aid centres counterproductive and intolerable and threatened more sanctions. But Mr Corbyn says that doesn't go far enough.
It's very simple. Until this government ends the sale of weapons to Israel, it will remain complicit in the mass murder of Palestinians in Gaza at the present time.
The government's already suspended some licences to those who supply weapons to Israel. Israel's accusing Hamas of stealing aid supplies. And a body has been found in the search for a man from Glasgow who went missing in Portugal. 38-year-old Greg Monks had been on a stag do. And remember our news podcast on the Times Radio app. Look for the Times News Briefing and the World in 10.
This is Times Radio.
Play Times Radio. Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, on the free Times Radio app, and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
And I'm John Pienaar here with Pienaar and Friends, Mikey Smith and Kate Ferguson. And Kate Bosse has dropped in to tell us about what's going on right after this show at 7 o'clock. Hello, Kate.
Hiya, John. We'll be digging into that phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. We know that Putin's told Trump he's going to respond to that astonishing attack by Ukraine on Russian airplanes at the weekend. So we'll talk a little more about that against the backdrop of defence spending in NATO, something we've been covering for a few days and I'm sure will become a really big story tomorrow. There's pressure on the UK, as we know, to get to 3.5%. The German defence ministers said this evening that the US's plea, whatever you want to call it, for 5% defence spending was really unrealistic. So we're starting to see a little bit of backlash, which will be good news for Britain, a bit of tempering, I think, at play there. We'll be talking about the US trade deal. Where is it? Well, what are the ramifications of what's happening on steel and aluminium today with Ali Redison, a former government advisor on trade. We'll go to Brussels to talk NATO with Bruno Waterfield of The Times. A couple of fresh stories as well. We'll be covering a story in tomorrow's paper that concerns the issue of small boats, that record number of migrants, nearly 1,200 crossing the English Channel on Saturday in a single day, and conversations that are happening between the UK and France to try and once and for all get past this issue of French border force officials, police, being unable to enter shallow water to try and intercept boats, something which people smugglers are taking advantage of, and something which, well, it's hugely frustrating for us to see in the UK. We saw that image, didn't we, of 3 border force police just stood with their arms crossed, unable to do anything. So there's an update on conversations there. And Juliet Samuel, the columnist for The Times, writes in the paper tomorrow, for all the talk in that strategic defence review and the general optics of sort of modern warfare, cyber attack, chemical weapons, etc., that actually many countries, including Poland and many of the Baltic states, have taken themselves out of something called the Ottawa Convention, which basically bans or pledges nations to not engage or use anti-personnel landmines. And a lot of nations coming out of that convention because they're arguing actually they are in huge prevalence in the Ukraine-Russia war, and that despite war being, or all the talk of war being technologically advanced, there are some very older traditional methods of warfare, ground combat, which is still very much in play. And she argues that Britain has not pledged to leave the Ottawa Convention, has not taken its commitment away not to use landmines because it's legally nervous about it. It's not facing up to one of the real threats and one of the real tools of battle should we need to engage, she argues. That features in tomorrow's paper and we'll cover that. And for something a bit different, a theatre boss, a theatre owner, is called to bring the curtain down on long duration shows, so theatre shows that last too long. I don't know about you, John, but I'm a massive fidget in the theatre. Like, I feel like I'm someone that can concentrate, but I've been to the theatre a lot recently and I've noticed that I am a bit of a fidgeter. I do like to have a drink with me. I like to shuffle around a bit, and then my back hurts a bit, and it takes something really engrossing to get me to stop fidgeting around. Yeah. So I'm all for this. Make them short and snappy.
And when you start noticing that you're uncomfortable, it starts becoming really unbearable. You do get intermissions, and there's a certain point when you start looking forward to your gin and tonic and whatever.
That's actually almost worse, because then you're thinking about the time when you can get to your gin. I went to see Mrs. Warren's Profession recently at the Garrick, the George Bernard Shaw play, and that was an hour and 45, and there was no interval. And actually, I really enjoyed it because I settled down for the hour 45. I wasn't thinking about when I could move, when I could get up, when I could go to the toilet. I just engrossed myself in it. So I actually rather liked not having an interval and it being an hour 45, unlike some of the super length plays around at the moment.
None of you can remember, because you're all too young, remember a time when there used to be intermissions at the cinema. Do you remember that?
Just.
They've brought
I think
that
I
back.
just about remember that as well.
What was it? There's a film out at the moment which was so long. They brought back intermissions at the cinema.
The Brutalist, apparently.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So they're making a comeback. That is too long. If you need an intermission
How
at the cinema,
long was that movie?
Don't know. I didn't watch it too long.
Yeah.
I can't believe you managed to think. Like, I would have been terrified of needing the loo without an intermission.
No, I just preferred it, and it was also really good, which
Yeah.
helps. But I think, ban anything. I mean, certainly anything over 3 hours. Who wants to sit in the theatre for more
Brutalist
than 3
was,
hours?
and it won the Oscar. But obviously, I suppose it earned it just on duration. I mean, I've got fond memories of the ice cream seller coming down the aisle with a thing. It was always her with a tray of ice creams and little tubs and whatever. It's a massive treat.
Well, as in during the interval or during the film?
No, you can't sell stuff during
I
the
don't know.
movie, can you? Or can
We
you?
can
Maybe
certainly
you can.
answer a mobile phone, according to most of the young people today.
Young people today. All right, look forward to the show. 7 o'clock, right after this one. I want to pick up and prime the pump of conversation a bit more on this phone call. The news of the conversation today between President Trump and Vladimir Putin, which came out while we've been on air. Now, there is a statement from Donald Trump, which I just want to share this with you, because in some ways I think it's quite revealing, and maybe not in a way that Donald Trump intended or would necessarily wish. But the statement says this. He says, I just finished speaking by telephone to President Putin. Call, he says, lasted an hour 15. We discussed the attack on Russia's docked airplanes by Ukraine and other attacks taking place by both sides. It was a good conversation, not a conversation that will lead to immediate peace. Now, I'm pausing there for just a second, because it was only a couple of days ago that President Trump was telling the world, and not for the first time, that he was going to see whether Putin was serious about wanting to get into peace talks, and he would be deciding in the space of the next 2 weeks, and that was about a week ago, whether he was not, and if so, then he'd be considering action. And here we have, in this latest statement, after an hour 15 conversation, it's not going to lead to immediate peace. He says then President Putin did say, and strongly, that he will have to respond to the recent attack on the airfields. So again, that's almost a note of understanding, certainly not of any faint hints of condemnation of the illegal invasion of Ukraine. And then here's the thing, and I'm not sure this note was quite intended. It moves on seamlessly to say, we also discussed Iran and the fact that time is running out on Iran's decision pertaining to nuclear weapons, which must be made quickly. I stated to President Putin, Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, and on this, I believe we were in agreement. President Putin suggested he'll participate in the discussions with Iran and that he could perhaps be helpful in getting this brought to a rapid conclusion. And so there we go, moving with barely a breath from Ukraine, and what looks as if a certain understanding on the part of President Trump to Vladimir Putin's refusal to contemplate peace, to Iran, where they seem to be talking rather like one leader to another, discussing ways of cooperating on a problem which both of them perceive. If you are Ukraine, if you are one of those countries, and there are many of them, lots of them in Brussels today at the NATO-Ukraine contact group meeting, you would read that and think, my goodness me, America is getting nowhere near where we need America to be.
Yeah, I mean, each time we hear from Trump with one of these phone calls with Putin, it's a reminder to them, to Ukraine and all that kind of Eastern Bloc that's near Russia, that's in their line of fire, that you've got to do everything you can to protect yourself, because the American shield of protection is no longer one that you can rely on. And it does feel that, Donald Trump 1 week threatens to walk away from talks. The next week he's having a conversation with Putin, and there's this new understanding. Maybe next week he'll be corralled by Keir and Macron into having another conversation with Zelensky, and we'll hear a slightly different tone. But the point is, we're not seeing that kind of strategic kind of line come out of America, and you're just not seeing them steadfast against their in solidarity with their traditional ally. So we're back, aren't we? We did the strategic defence review this week. We're back with how much money we're going to spend on defence. Can we protect ourselves if America's wobbly? Can Ukraine win this war without American protection? I note this week and take heart from the fact that Ukraine managed to carry out that incredibly exciting, audacious drone attack on those Russian fleets, which were really incredible. Incredible footage where you just see them taking out those parked planes miles and miles away. Also, that bridge over Crimea, it's Ukraine's own kind of chutzpah and drone attacks that are really protecting it at the moment, rather than the Americans.
I do want to get on to the question of British defence spending and how much is Britain going to be, is Keir Starmer and John Healey, how much are they going to be committing this country to over quite a number of years by way of the level of defence spending? It seems under a certain amount of duress. I mean, the signals to that effect are very, very strong indeed. But just on this matter of America's commitment to Ukraine, you don't get much clearer a signal, do you, than the fact that the US Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth did not turn up at today's Ukraine contact group meeting in Brussels?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't entirely surprised that Pete Hegseth didn't do that, because that seems like a very Pete Hegseth thing to do, over and above whether it's part of America's grander plan. I think this phone call, you're right, the readout of this, I say readout, this is from a Donald Trump Truth Social post, so, potentially in his own hand. It is fascinating, because one thing we know about Donald Trump is that quite a lot of his opinions and his views are led by whoever he last spoke to. So I wouldn't be surprised. That silver-tongued devil Vladimir Putin, it reads to me like he has charmed the pants off him.
Wouldn't you love to listen in on that?
I would love to. I mean, an hour and a quarter in it isn't likely to lead to peace. What did they talk about?
You wouldn't even need ice cream. It would just be.
But I wouldn't be surprised now if there was not a queue of European leaders trying to get Donald on the phone. To try and talk him round. Because he's been led one way
if
by.
They think that is still worth doing. I mean, whether they don't, they will. You're right. They will still be doing their best to lobby. While where there's life, there's hope. They can't afford to give up on that possibility. Anyway, we're going to talk about British defence spending in a moment, because there's a lot I want to hear your thoughts on in just a minute. This is Pienaar and Friends on Times Radio.
I've eaten at every embassy in Europe. I've had goose in Georgia, oysters in Oman, a curry in Kabul cooked by a colonel's wife.
Carol Morris brings you a first look at the Sunday Times front page splash. Saturday nights from 10:30. John Pienaar on Times Radio.
And here with me on Pienaar and Friends, Kate Ferguson from the Sun on Sunday and Mikey Smith from the Mirror. So let's talk about British defence spending, because that story's been moving. I mean, I'm going to start by saying, when we talk about 2.5%, 2.7%, 3%, 3.5% of national earnings on defence, those numbers don't mean a huge amount, because we just don't know what it might add up to by the time those numbers come around. But there is quite a tug of war. It has a lot to do with the depth of commitment that the government is willing to make at a given moment, that is now. And what's been happening on that? Well, look, we had this commitment of we're paying 2.5% of our national earnings on defence. Then we had the big announcement from Keir Starmer that it's going to go up to 2.7% at the cost of the overseas aid budget, a very severe cut in overseas aid, which was quite a big thing to do. I mean, there was one resignation from the cabinet, Annalisa Dodds, over that. Otherwise, comparatively little public outrage on the Labour side. A lot of Labour MPs quietly unhappy, but no great fuss. And then it had to move on. And now 3%. The Defence Review published a couple of days ago, it talks about, and it was there already, 3% of national earnings in the course of the next Parliament. So between the next election and the one after that. And now the story is that Keir Starmer is under enormous pressure to say 3.5%, a full 0.5% of entire national earnings on defence in the course of that further Parliament. He was reluctant enough to commit absolutely unequivocally to 3%. But now lots of reporting, Kate and Mikey, that he's going to do it. He's going to go 3.5%. Yes, that's what Donald Trump insists on. He wants more, by the way. And we're going to see it in a couple of weeks' time at The Hague at NATO. First of all, guys, is that what you are picking up, that is going to happen?
Yeah, they're under huge pressure to find this extra money for defence. It's also starting to be enmeshed in Keir Starmer's more general offering to the electorate. So this isn't just we live in scary times and we need to rearm because, Russia's tanks are in Ukraine and they could roll on to Estonia and elsewhere in Europe, although it is that. But he's linking it to his new economic offer. So he's very much linking, like, we will put this money into defence to protect our country, but with that, I'm going to create new jobs. Bombs equals jobs really is the mantra at the moment in Downing Street. It's this blue-collar, decent, industrial jobs. It will keep our alliance with America on side. We're going to also bid for these European defence contracts. So it's do you remember when Boris's mantra was jobs, jobs, jobs?
Yeah.
I think we're going to see more of that from Keir. Jobs, jobs, jobs. But it's this new industrial base. And so I think he's under huge pressure to find this money, but in order to find it and to sell it as more than just a nice to have, it's going to be totally linked with that economic growth argument.
And when the time comes in a couple of weeks' time at The Hague, and the question is, are you now committing? Look, 2 parliaments off, but are you committing to 3.5% of our national earnings on defence? Because Donald Trump today is saying 5% is what he wants. He doesn't just want it, in 2 parliaments, 10 years' time. He wants it to start now. That is why the German defence minister said that's just not realistic. How do you reckon, we can't know, so we're just guessing here, but why not, that Keir Starmer, Mikey, is going to deal with this? Are we just going to have, an enormous fudge, which is maybe the only way to do it?
I suspect so. I suspect there will be some kind of fudge. There has to be. You'll have noted that John Healey in the Commons yesterday was very much not ruling out tax rises to pay for increased defence spending, and that's the conversation that Keir Starmer really doesn't want to have. I'm not sure why. We were joking before that I'd be all for a wealth tax to pay for the army. I'm kind of all for a wealth tax to pay for the army. At this point, I think Keir Starmer's running out of time, which seems daft to say when he's really only just won an election, but he's running out of time where he can use his massive majority to raise taxes, and he can't commit to any kind of defence spending increase of the order that Donald Trump is demanding without doing so. Yeah. So that needs to happen soon. It's
also, it's worth noting that these timelines are being kicked beyond election, right? So on the one hand, you can commit and be like, well, let's just see where we are next time. I will remind the listener, we have raised taxes. There were £40 billion of taxes raised last year. So he's used his time to raise taxes. I will also remind the listener, there's no such thing as a wealth tax, really, apart from the fact that all taxes are a tax on our wealth.
Okay.
There are some wealth taxes that have gone relatively recently untapped.
Okay.
Council tax, for example, you can redo the banding on council tax to.
Actually, this is an interesting story. We had a bit of this in the Sun on Sunday recently. I know the Treasury have drawn up plans to slap Brits with it. They would call it a mansion tax.
Yes.
The tabloidese. But this idea of an extra council tax band, Treasury were pushing back. Treasury ministers were pushing back quite hard against it because it will go down like a bucket of cold sick with voters. But look. The tricky thing for Keir is how do you get this money realistically in the pipeline where you've got this triple manifesto tax block, which Rachel, I think, repeated this morning that she won't increase VAT, income or employee NICs. She's done the only other thing that will raise big amounts of money, which is employer NICs. Every other tax rise is fiddling. It's a few billion here and there. And she needs that just to kind of balance the books with her departmental spending. So I think a lot of these commitments, we might see them pushed beyond the election date.
Yeah, Labour did have a plan for a wealth tax in the last election, but 3 now? Also, whenever Ed Miliband was the leader of the Labour Party, there was a mansion tax, which would have hit especially hard in the city, around London and the southeast. It went down like a lead balloon and cost a lot of votes in really important marginal seats. And for that reason, you haven't heard too much about it. Jeremy Corbyn obviously liked taxing, people with more money than he thought was appropriate pretty heavily, but that was another story. Wealth taxes, there you go. A wealth tax to pay for defence, because we started this on defence. Is the British public ready for such a thing? When we've just been talking here, we three in this studio, and our listeners joining in, that the police are saying they can't afford to police and they need more money. Can you say, OK, yeah, we're going to raise more money by way of wealth taxes for military spending? Look, I'm not an opponent of more money on military spending. I just add in brackets. But what about the public? Are they ready for that? And maybe the job is to get them ready for that sort of thing.
There was some polling last week, I forget where it was from, but there was some polling last week that suggested that raising taxes to pay for military spending was fairly popular. It was more than 50% it polled at, so I think you're fine.
Gosh, that's so... Gosh, you just went straight there. It's like, that's fine, you know.
It's fine. Well, look, the thing about wealth taxes and mansion taxes, there's this conventional wisdom that people hate wealth taxes, mansion taxes, taxes on high earners. Well, people hate those. They go down badly with voters because they assume, they think, they hope that one day they will find themselves wealthy enough to pay them, when in reality they won't, most of them. With the best will in the world, most people will not pay these taxes. And I think probably what needs to happen, if you're going to do these, is you're going to have a period of unpopularity where people are like, well, I don't want to be stuck with a wealth tax when I win the lottery or whatever. And if you hold your nerve with that, it will inevitably happen that people will realise, actually, I don't pay this. Why was I bothered? And now I have an army that's nice and shiny.
Look, let's definitely have a real conversation about how we pay for defence. Procurement is ridiculous. The billions and billions wasted are horrendous. Look how bloated aspects of the state are. Let's take that money and let's put that into troops and bombs and drones. Please, Keir Starmer, do not listen to the siren voices on the left saying all your problems will be solved with this magical thing called a wealth tax. And you can't just dismiss, oh, I'm a British person and I don't like this tax because I think one day I might pay it. Hold your nerve, as in do something really unpopular that person that voted for you last time, who, by the way, did not vote for Mr. Miliband, but voted for you because you went around and said, we will not raise your taxes. And that was the only promise you basically had in your whole manifesto. Hold your nerve and to kind of tear up that promise isn't the best political advice, Mikey.
For most people, that promise will have been kept. Most people will not pay those taxes.
Look, you've got to be careful when it comes to raising taxes. We're already clobbered by sky-high taxes. The problem with this country is not that we're not taxed enough. There's a lot of problems with this country. It is not that we are not taxed enough.
Yeah, I mean, Michael in Manchester writes in, why will no one ever dare talk about capital gains on homeowners' profits on the primary home when it's sold? Well, yes, I mean, thank you for that contribution, Michael. It may be that if you've bought your own home and maybe you're not earning a huge amount of money, you had to scrape quite hard to get the money to make that happen, and you're going to be hit with capital gains on your first home, the proceeds of which you hope to use for your second home. That might not be especially popular.
No, I know I wouldn't like it. Would you like it, Mikey?
I don't own a home, but it wouldn't it wouldn't be the first well I'd go to.
But the fact is, we're talking about the comprehensive spending review in a couple of weeks' time. We know there's a budget coming in the autumn, and we know, although no one in government is going to admit it, there are going to be tax rises in that budget.
Exactly.
And maybe the time is to start persuading people of that, to fess up a little bit and not do, again, what happened in the general election, which is to fudge it, ignore it, and then just do it and live with the blowback.
I think this is part of the problem with transplanting the Ming Vase strategy that they had during the election, where you don't want to upset anyone, you don't want to do anything wrong, into governing, because governing is an exercise in upsetting as few people as possible, but still upsetting people.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that they didn't put anything really in their manifesto, so now they're trying to do that stuff. They don't actually have the kind of voter buy-in or the political support for it. That manifesto was too Ming Vase. That is a political phrase, but it basically didn't confess enough. But I think we will continue to see Rachel Reeves kind of almost be this essay crisis chancellor. She's not going to want to tear up that tax pledge, because once they've torn that up, what else is there from that manifesto? That's it. You've betrayed the manifesto. I think you're going to see her, look at this gambling levy that Gordon Brown wants so much. Do these tweaks that raise a few billion here, a few billion there, get through to the next budget. There is a question about, does that last the whole parliament? But I think that's what we're going to continue to see her do. You will get your kind of lefty voices within the PLP, but also in the think tank scene or whatever, say raise VAT. But I don't see that happening this autumn.
She's already had to sort of plead changing circumstances when it came to the measures that we've seen happen so far. Can you imagine having a budget and saving taxes for still later on in the Parliament, closer to another election. I struggled with that one, just by the normal rules of politics. David's written in. Oh, you started this. Okay, David says, I've just received 3 points for doing 24 miles an hour. First speeding fine in 30 years. Ridiculous. The police can't be bothered to tackle shoplifting, minor mugging and the like, but they have no problem giving me 3 points and £100 fine. The letter from the police was on my doormat within a week. The authentic anger of David, and we're privileged to have you air that and share that with us on the programme this evening. You'll get other chances. We're not going anywhere. We're going to be back. Mikey, thanks for coming. Lovely to see you. Likewise, Kate. Thank you all for listening to the programme. Well, we had Ollie Cole producing, Isaac Marley was our technical operator, and Kate is up next on Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the times.